As we continue on with the Wars of Light and Dark, nearing the signature event that would mark the Jedi and Sith as enemies for the next 4,000 years, there's another name that must be known. One that was merely a footnote, yet it had a massive impact. For you see, this character, faceless, barely known, and who went, as all politicians do, fade into obscurity after serving, may have been the greatest ally of the Sith has ever had. Now, I'm going to warn you guys, this is going to get dark. And let's be fair, when you get further and further along when it comes to the Wars of Light and Darkness, it's going to get uncomfortable. That is going to be for sure the truth, because there's no way to avoid it. And this is one of them. A simple man, not force sensitive, not chosen by a special destiny, just a politician who lived in a very dangerous time. Let's get started. His name was Poltimo, and he served during the time of the Great Hyperspace War. As far as we know, he was just a regular politician, one who looked out for his own interests and those of his people, as all senators from the Republic did. Eventually, he'd rise to the position of Supreme Chancellor, shortly before hostilities commenced between the Republic and the Sith Empire. While the Jedi and Empress Teta led the battle that would see the Sith Empire defeated, back on Coruscant, there was another crisis developing, because the Senate bayed for blood, as they had in times past. Every war that they've ever waged, with their citizens angered and sending them messages, holocalls, and wanting revenge for the death that was inflicted upon them, the loss that they had suffered. Once more, the monster that was the Republic had awakened, spurred to action because of an unprovoked attack that reached all the way to Coruscant itself. Scars screamed for retribution, as the very halls of the Senate threatened to break into warfare between the senators. It was a conflicting time. What's worse, Poltimo had been on Coruscant when the attack happened. His life had been on the line, and the wounds inflicted were deep. It shattered the illusion of safety that had been built up on the world since the time of the 7th Outspoken conflict, the Pious Dia era. A price had to be paid for that. And for what came next, Jedi Archivist Nostoral would later consider it a mistake.
Jedi and Republic forces were sent to Korriban and other Sith planets to ensure no remnants of the Sith Empire remained. It was this action which drove the surviving Sith to flee into deep space, with the new Dark Lord who rose to take Naka Sadow's place.
But it was more than just that. You see, Poltimo ordered the Republic Navy and requested the aid of the Jedi to enter Sith space to ensure that they would never be a threat again, by destroying every dark side institution, obliterating every cultural touchstone, every advancement, everything that the Sith had created or touched, purging every sacred site, and destroying the very foundations of their civilization. His order to counter-invade the Sith Empire resulted in the Sith Genocide, an event the Jedi would be blamed for by Vitia's Empire. Now, I imagine a number of you are wondering how I could even call him an ally for causing a genocide. How could that even be a good thing? At the time, it wasn't. It still isn't, to be entirely honest. But when you take a larger view of the situation and how it's weaved through the course of history, you see that it benefited the Sith in ways never imagined. You see, prior to the counter-invasion, the Sith Empire had already been defeated. Their military forces were gone. And as established in the 100-Year Darkness and Sith Species entries, the Asterion Caldera was essentially a prison, difficult to navigate through, with it being easier to enter than to exit, which allowed vessels to be deposited within Sith space. That is what allowed them to remain technologically competitive with the Republic in terms of shipbuilding. The biggest issue the Republic had with the Sith prior to the war was that they were an unknown entity. They were aware that the Sith existed somewhere in the galaxy, but no one knew precisely where. When the Sith invasion occurred, it allowed the Republic and the Jedi to learn how far the Sith were, how much infrastructure they had, and how much power they possessed, turning them into a known entity. The Supreme Chancellor was given very few choices. In his place, I would believe that it would have actually been rather easily to contain and quarantine the space around the Sith world, having ships patrol beyond the borders. The Sith technological development would have degraded without access to newer technology, to study and to reverse engineer. It would have kept them bottlenecked, and with them unable to challenge the Republic and the Jedi due to their overwhelming might, the Sith would have had two choices. Either they would have turned on one another and entered a massive civil war due to lack of expansion, or they would become regular members of the galactic community, likely abandoning dark side practices in part to gain acceptance. Unfortunately, circumstances did not allow for that approach, but the Senate were the ultimate arbiters of what happened, and any form of restraint at that time was seen as nothing more than a half measure. By committing the counter-invasion, however, it caused a massive genocidal event. Let's be fair, there is no way you can send soldiers into enemy territory and expect them to not commit atrocities, especially when they are emotionally charged after their homes were attacked attacked and people they cared about were killed, it was a recipe for disaster. What's worse, you had those who believed that these actions would have actually helped the Sith blood population, Ultima among them, thinking that would free them from the dark side's corruption. Despite all that, here's the benefit that Sith actually gained from this nonsense. It stripped away artifacts and relics, scattered them across the galaxy, preserving them for later generations who could be inspired to become Sith themselves. The Sith people, while most were killed, scattered across wild space. Amongst the largest surviving bands were those who followed Vitiate, who would create the resurgent Sith Empire with him at the head. These actions likely would not have occurred without Ultima's decision, if he wasn't forced to go with this. And as a result, he was an ally of unintended consequence. The reason Sith kept resurfacing time and time again, because many of the artifacts and many of the relics that were taken away by the Republic could only be destroyed by dark side magic and by dark side energy, which, if the Sith went into a massive civil war, well, you can imagine that the majority of those artifacts and relics would have been literally turned to dust as a result. But no. Of course, some will question about Vitiate. After all, he rose to power to become the Sith Emperor after the war. The question would be, wouldn't he just do that in this scenario as well? In which case I have to say, no. The issue with the original scenario is that the Sith Lords were witnessing their worlds being taken by an external force that was encroaching on all their domains. The fleet was gone, there was no time to build more ships, and entire populations were being wiped out. This created the perfect conditions for Vitiate to call various Sith Lords together with the promise that he had discovered a new power capable of defeating the Republic. That enticement drew them in, primarily out of fear, but also because Vitiate was considered a non-notable Sith Lord. They believed that he was too weak to stop them from simply taking whatever power he discovered for themselves. Without that external threat, the various Sith Lords would vie for power amongst themselves. The Sith Council would have been dissolved due to the deaths of its members, and the disappearance of the reigning Dark Lord Sith at the time, and the absence of a Republic invasion. This would have led to a massive civil war to determine the next Dark Lord of the Sith. While Vitiate would still emerge during that period and throw his hat in the ring, and to be entirely honest, also win, it would be a wildly different conflict. Unlike other succession crises, there would be no clear contenders who were the strongest, because they were all dead at that point. This would become a battle royale, with various Sith Lords using what resources they had to crush their rivals. We're talking about more than 8,000 Sith Lords that were present at the time. Conflicts like these normally last a century when it's just a few hundred contenders, not the entire empire imploding at once. But there's one other issue, a time factor. People of Sith, those not hybridized, can live roughly 300 years, but rarely do so because they're usually killed long before then. Hence why King Adus was so exceptional. Hybridized Sith had much shorter lifespans, closer to 200 years. Vitiate was a true pureblood Sith, but by the time of the Great Hyperspace War, he was already over a century old. In a normal succession crisis, this would not have been an issue. Again, as I stressed, that this would not be normal. The Sith Lords required to fuel his ritual would have been killed during the infighting, leaving him without the means to drain Madrias and become a pseudo-immortal. He would have attempted to extend his life to other methods, of course, but just with King Adus and Marka Ragnos, those methods lose effectiveness past a certain point. This scenario severely disadvantages Vitiate, especially given that he would be forced to rebuild a society that destroyed itself once again. We could continue examining how the Sith Empire might have evolved under those conditions, or whether the threat would have eventually been entirely eliminated. But now, you see why I call the Supreme Chancellor Ultimo the Sith's greatest ally. He was one of coincidence. Acting out of fear and conviction when a better option existed, the desire to ensure the Sith were destroyed was too great. And in pursuit of that goal, he guaranteed their survival by destroying them and making them stronger.